Priorities. Under scrutiny, President Bio's absence on Sierra Leone Independence Day sparks public debate. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, where African stories are analyzed with courage, clarity, and conviction. I'm Abdul Karim Kargbo, born and raised in Africa. Today, we tackle a burning issue that has shaken Sierra Leone and echoes across the continent. Why was President Bio absent on Independence Day, and what does it tell us about leadership and democracy in Africa? Stay tuned for a critical, Africa-wide perspective you won't find anywhere else. The recent decision by Sierra Leone's President Julius Maada Bio to forego the country's Independence Day celebrations in favor of attending the funeral of the late Pope Francis in Rome has stirred a national and continental debate about leadership priorities, symbolism, and the evolving relationship between African governance and civic expectations. While constitutionally permissible, the president's absence on the eve of April 27th, a date etched deeply in Sierra Leone's national identity, has raised questions about the optics of power, public engagement, and the symbolic weight of national celebrations. Public outcry, symbolism versus legality. Leading the chorus of concern is Thomas Moore Conteh, Executive Director of the Citizens Advocacy Network, a prominent civil society watchdog in Sierra Leone. In his statement, Conteh acknowledged that President Bio was under no legal obligation to attend the anniversary ceremony. However, he emphasized the broader issue of political accountability and public symbolism, asserting that the president's absence sends a strong message about what the government considers a national priority. There's no law that says the president must be present during Independence Day, Conteh stated. But out of respect for the people, when you're celebrating your country's independence, that's one of the most historic days in any nation's life. Conteh further stressed that Independence Day is not merely a ceremonial event, but an opportunity for introspection and accountability. It is a moment when the leadership is expected to reflect on the country's progress, renew its social contract with citizens, and inspire hope among the population, particularly in a country still grappling with poverty, economic uncertainty, and institutional fragility. The government's response, a matter of personal devotion. In defense of President Bio, Mike Barewa, Director of Communications at the Office of the President, clarified that the president attended the funeral of the late Pope due to a personal and spiritual bond. According to Barewa, the Pope had been a spiritual guide and personal confidant to the president, someone who called and prayed for him. However, this explanation has not been sufficient to temper the criticism. Conteh countered, "It's a matter of priority. The president considered the Pope's funeral more important, even though it clashed with our country's Independence Day." Critical analysis, the politics of presence in African leadership. In many African nations, Independence Day is more than just a historical commemoration. It is a symbolic reaffirmation of sovereignty, identity, and the struggles for self-determination. For post-colonial states such as Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, the day serves as a platform for the leadership to rally citizens around a shared national vision. In Ghana, for example, former President Nana Akufo-Addo has consistently used the country's March 6 Independence Day to roll out key policy themes and showcase unity. Similarly, Kenya's Jamhuri Day, Independence Day, is used as a vehicle to unveil development plans and affirm state commitments to democratic governance. Against this backdrop, President Bio's absence appears symbolically tone-deaf, especially at a time when Sierra Leone faces worsening inflation, rising youth unemployment, and growing public distrust in democratic institutions. IMF Country Report number 2445, 2024. Regional comparisons, when absence undermines authority. Across Africa, leaders' presence at major national milestones is often seen as an expression of state stability and political continuity. During Nigeria's 2023 Independence Day, even amid security threats in Abuja, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu addressed the nation from the capital and led commemorative events. In South Sudan, a relatively new state, the mere act of the president attending independence celebrations is treated as a national unifier in a country still racked by internal conflict. In contrast, President Bio's decision risks being interpreted as elitist detachment or misplaced loyalty to external institutions, echoing an old post-colonial critique that African leaders are too often more beholden to foreign figures and powers than to their own people. A missed opportunity for national reconciliation and renewal. Given Sierra Leone's tenuous political climate following the disputed 2023 general elections, CEU Election Observation Mission Final Report 2023, President Bio's absence on a day of national unity could be viewed as a missed opportunity. As Conteh pointed out, the anniversary could have served as a platform for the president to address the country directly, acknowledging challenges, reaffirming commitments, and connecting emotionally with ordinary citizens. It's a very important event for rekindling the spirit of our poor citizens, people who look up to their leaders to lift them from the doorsteps of underdevelopment to the hope they've been promised. Forward-looking implications. Reimagining civic engagement in African leadership. President Bio's decision reignites a broader conversation on what constitutes meaningful leadership in Africa's 21st century democratic landscape. It also reflects the tension between personal convictions and public expectations. While diplomatic presence and global solidarity are crucial, the balance between the ceremonial duties of statecraft and the symbolic acts of leadership at home is vital. African civil society is evolving, and citizens, especially the youth, are increasingly attuned to the symbolism of political decisions. Leaders who appear disconnected from national pride or civic rituals risk alienating key segments of the population and undermining their own legitimacy. Public sentiment, political fallout, and diaspora reactions. As debate continues over President Bio's absence from Sierra Leone's 64th Independence Day celebration, citizen sentiment across social media platforms and community forums reveals a deeper undercurrent of discontent, one not just rooted in this particular incident, but fueled by a series of perceived governmental missteps and symbolic disconnects. Domestic reaction. Independence without unity. Among the general public, reactions have ranged from disappointment to outright anger, with many questioning what they see as a pattern of unaccountability and aloofness in the president's leadership style. The national holiday, which should have been marked by speeches of hope, performances celebrating cultural heritage, and addresses outlining the administration's achievements and future direction, felt muted and impersonal to many. Street interviews conducted by the Bold African Voice, BAV, in Freetown, Bo and Kenema, revealed that some citizens interpreted the president's absence as evidence that ordinary people's emotions and symbolic milestones are not valued by the political elite. How can he leave us to attend the funeral of someone who wasn't even Sierra Leonean on the same day we're supposed to celebrate our freedom? Asked Fatmata Karoma, a trader in downtown Freetown. We needed to see our president. Even if he gave us nothing, his presence would have meant everything, said Ibrahim Jallo, a university student in Bo. These views, although anecdotal, mirror growing concerns raised in a recent Afrobarometer survey, 2024, which indicated a 17% drop in trust in the presidency over the past 2 years, particularly among urban youth and rural low-income earners. 2 critical voting blocks. Opposition capitalizes. A political opportunity for the APC. The Opposition All People's Congress, APC, has wasted no time in framing the president's absence as political negligence. In a press release issued on April 28, APC spokesperson Lansana Doumbouya described Bio's decision as a betrayal of national pride and an insult to the people of Sierra Leone. The APC has seized this moment to revive their narrative of the SLPP administration being out of touch with ordinary citizens, especially amid ongoing economic hardship, rising cost of living, and disillusionment over unmet development promises. At a time when unity, hope, and patriotism should have been at the forefront, President Bio chose the global stage over his people, the statement read. Political analysts say the event may become a critical rallying point in the lead up to the 2028 general elections, especially if opposition parties can successfully frame the absence as emblematic of deeper leadership failures. Diaspora voices, painful symbolism for a global audience. Interestingly, the criticism of President Bio's absence has not been confined to Sierra Leone's borders. The Sierra Leonean diaspora community, particularly in the United Kingdom, United States, and Canada, has expressed disappointment via digital town halls and diaspora-led civil society platforms. On April 27th, the Sierra Leone Diaspora Network in Toronto held a virtual commemoration of Independence Day, during which several speakers lamented the president's absence and described it as deeply symbolic of a leadership drifting from national identity. As diasporans, we fight every day to keep our heritage alive. For our leader to turn his back on that day, it's not just symbolic, it's a blow to our collective pride, said Dr. Mariatu Kanu, a diaspora academic based in Maryland. Others, however, offered a more measured perspective, acknowledging the spiritual and diplomatic motivations behind the president's choice, while still emphasizing that timing and optics matter in modern governance. A continental lens, what African presidents can learn. This incident has become a case study in political optics and civic expectations, highlighting the importance of ritual, symbolism, and presence in African leadership. From South Africa's Heritage Day to Ethiopia's Victory of Adwa celebrations, African heads of state are increasingly expected to embody the national spirit during key cultural and historical observances. President Bio's absence, though arguably well-intentioned, underscores a growing tension faced by many African leaders, balancing global diplomacy and personal convictions with domestic expectations and public accountability. This is especially true in an age of heightened civic awareness, where social media ensures that symbolic missteps travel fast and resonate deeply. As Afrobarometer 2024 points out, African citizens increasingly evaluate their leaders not just on policy outcomes, but also on performative leadership, moments where they show up, speak out, and stand beside their people. What's next? Navigating a reputational recovery. President Bio's communications team now faces a critical test of narrative control. They must decide whether to double down on their justification or engage in soft damage control, possibly through post-event national addresses, development-related policy rollouts, or regional visits to re-engage communities that felt abandoned on April 27th. Meanwhile, civil society groups, opposition parties, and international observers will be watching closely to see whether this was a one-time misjudgment or part of a broader leadership disconnect. Absentee leadership across Africa, a growing pattern of disengagement? President Julius Maada Bio's absence from Sierra Leone's Independence Day celebration reflects a broader and increasingly visible trend across parts of the African continent. The rise of absentee leadership, where heads of state are physically or symbolically distant from national affairs during pivotal civic moments. This phenomenon is not unique to Sierra Leone. In Cameroon, President Paul Biya has been notoriously absent from the country for extended periods, often residing in Geneva while national crises unfold at home. Similarly, Zimbabwe's Emerson Mnangagwa has faced criticism for frequent international travel and delayed responses to domestic issues, including natural disasters and economic protests. In each of these cases, citizens have voiced similar frustrations: a sense of abandonment, a loss of national dignity, and a widening gulf between the state and its people. According to a 2023 report by Transparency International Africa, absenteeism by elected leaders during major national events or crises is strongly correlated with declining trust in institutions, falling voter turnout, and rising civil unrest. The role of symbolic leadership in rebuilding fragile state Sierra Leone, emerging from a civil war that ended in 2002 and still recovering from shocks like the Ebola crisis, 2014-2016, and COVID-19 pandemic relies heavily on symbols of unity, stability, and nationhood. The Independence Day celebration, in particular, represents more than a historic milestone. It is a reminder of what the country fought for and what it must still strive to become. Leadership in such contexts is not only about policymaking or economic growth metrics, it is also about embodied presence, public rituals, and the affirmation of collective memory. By being absent on such a day, President Bio risked inadvertently signaling detachment from the emotional and historical foundation of the nation at a time when economic hardship and rising inequality have already strained public morale. Repercussions on the international stage, diplomacy or disconnect. In the international arena, a leader's domestic posture during national commemorations often speaks volumes to allies, development partners, and investors. President Bio's presence at the funeral of the late Pope Francis undoubtedly earned him diplomatic points within religious and Vatican-linked networks, particularly given the Pope's moral stature on the global stage. However, international observers may also question whether this diplomatic gesture came at the cost of domestic legitimacy. Foreign governments, multilateral donors, and international NGOs working in Sierra Leone have increasingly emphasized citizen engagement, accountability, and social cohesion as preconditions for partnerships. For example, the European Union's governance compact with Sierra Leone prioritizes inclusive political processes and responsive leadership, especially in post-conflict states. As one EU diplomat in Freetown, speaking anonymously to the Bold African Voice, BAV, noted, "While the Pope's funeral was undeniably significant, there is a growing concern that key African leaders often overlook their own national milestones in favor of global optics. The missed opportunity for national messaging and policy clarity Independence Day speeches offer more than ceremonial reflection. They serve as strategic platforms to reset policy narratives, announce reforms, and inspire hope. In Sierra Leone's case, where inflation hovers above 25%, World Bank 2025 Q1 economic brief, and the Leone continues to depreciate against the US dollar, this year's anniversary could have served as an ideal moment for the president to directly address economic recovery plans, reassure struggling citizens, and clarify government priorities. Moving forward, a call for recalibrated civic rituals and leadership presence. To restore public confidence, Sierra Leone's leadership may need to reinvest in civic rituals, events that unify, reflect, and project a shared national future. These include not only Independence Day, but also National Peace Day, Heroes Day, if established, and annual national development forums where government and citizens engage openly. Political scientists argue that countries with high civic participation and inclusive commemorations tend to foster stronger social cohesion and political resilience, especially during economic turbulence. In Ghana, for instance, the annual Independence Day events are often rotated among regions, encouraging local pride and national belonging. In Rwanda, President Paul Kagame uses Liberation Day to highlight national achievements and outline future priorities, despite criticisms of his governance style in other areas. Sierra Leone could adapt such models, bringing celebrations closer to the people, decentralizing national events, and using them not just for reflection, but for policy feedback and participatory planning. Reclaiming Independence Day, youth, faith leaders, and civil society reimagine national belonging civic actors. Step in, filling the symbolic void. In the absence of President Julius Maada Bio at the helm of Sierra Leone's Independence Day commemorations, an unexpected but powerful coalition of youth leaders, faith institutions, traditional leaders, and civil society organizations stepped forward to reshape the meaning of April 27th. Rather than letting the occasion pass quietly or with resentment, these groups transformed it into an opportunity for community-led national reflection, grassroots engagement, and alternative forms of patriotic expression. In Freetown, the Citizens Advocacy Network, led by Thomas Moore Conteh, organized a symbolic public gathering at the Cotton Tree Memorial Grounds, bringing together students, vendors, laborers, and artists for an open-air dialogue. The theme, Independence Without Development, Where Do We Go From Here? This event, though grassroots in nature, drew hundreds and sparked conversations across other districts, from Koidu to Kabbalah. The president may have missed the day, but the people did not, said Conteh. We came together not just to criticize, but to remind ourselves that sovereignty belongs to the people. Our celebration of independence must not be dependent on State House. In Kanema, religious leaders from both Christian and Muslim communities hosted an interfaith prayer session calling for peace, unity, and a reawakening of national purpose. Faith-based messaging, a subtle rebuke of priorities? Interestingly, the involvement of religious leaders, particularly the Interreligious Council of Sierra Leone, took on an added symbolic weight. While their tone remained largely conciliatory, several clerics used Independence Day sermons to implicitly contrast the absence of political leadership with the enduring presence of spiritual leadership. In a homily delivered at the St. Anthony's Cathedral in Freetown, Bishop Edward Tamba Charles reminded the congregation, "True leadership is not about where you go, but who you are with in their hour of need. Our people are in need of hope, direction, and truth." In mosques across the country, imams offered similar reflections, invoking the Quranic principle of amana, trust and responsibility, in the exercise of authority. These messages, while spiritually grounded, subtly questioned the moral calculus behind President Bio's decision to prioritize Rome over Freetown on such a day. Youth engagement. From passive observers to active patriots. One of the most striking outcomes of this leadership vacuum was the mobilization of Sierra Leone's youth, who make up over 60% of the population. Often dismissed as politically apathetic or economically disillusioned, this Independence Day saw young people claim a new role as narrators of the national story. Social media was abuzz with hashtags like Our Independence, Our Future, World Leadership Matters, and 27 April Reclaimed as youth influencers posted videos, poems, and live reflections. The most viral clip featured a 16-year-old student in Makini reciting her poem titled We Waited at the Gate, lamenting the absence of leadership while affirming her generation's readiness to lead. We waited at the gate for a word from above, but silence answered our cries, not love. Still, we rise, not because of who came, but because of who we are and the power in our name. Youth-led civic tech groups also launched an online accountability tracker, allowing citizens to measure government performance against promises made during previous Independence Day addresses. This kind of digital civic activism points to a generational shift in how Sierra Leoneans engage with governance and hold leaders accountable, no longer passively awaiting directives from above, but actively shaping the narrative from below. Cultural revival, reclaiming history through the arts. Meanwhile, the creative community, musicians, dramatists, filmmakers, and spoken word artists seized the opportunity to reframe Independence Day as a cultural revival. Across Freetown, concerts, pop-up theaters, and poetry slams replaced the typical state parade and military displays. The National Museum of Sierra Leone hosted a week-long exhibition titled Echoes of Liberation, featuring art and stories from the independence struggle, women's movements, and Civil War survivors. The message was clear. Independence is not a date, but a continuous struggle, passed from one generation to the next. Renowned folk singer, K-Man, performed an acoustic rendition of Sweet Salone, drawing spontaneous tears and applause as he sang, If the flag forgets our name, we'll write it again in dust and flame. For we are not the silence left behind, we are the rhythm, raw and kind. National identity in flux, between disillusionment and renewal. This year's Independence Day has, ironically, become one of the most emotionally resonant in recent memory, not because of state-led festivities, but because of the vacuum left in their absence. That vacuum was filled not by cynicism alone, but by creative resistance, civic innovation, and a collective reimagining of what it means to be Sierra Leonean. The symbolic disengagement of the president created space for grassroots leadership to emerge, suggesting that in fragile democracies, the soul of the nation may reside less in formal institutions and more in the civic pulse of its people. But the big question lingers. Will the state take notice? Will this surge in citizen agency lead to systemic change? Or will it fade without structural support, recognition, or reform? Electoral reverberations, how Independence Day fallout could reshape Sierra Leone's political landscape. The road to 2028, a turning point for public trust? With Sierra Leone's next general election slated for 2028, the symbolic ripple effects of President Julius Maada Bio's absence during this year's Independence Day celebrations could evolve into a substantive political liability. In a country where elections are as much about perception as they are about policy, the president's decision has handed opposition parties, particularly the All People's Congress, APC, an unexpected opportunity to reframe the political narrative. Political strategists within the APC have reportedly begun crafting campaign messaging around themes of presence, patriotism, and people-first leadership. In backroom discussions and early planning meetings, the phrase "absent on the day that matters most" has surfaced as a potential slogan, subtly invoking President Bio's Rome trip as symbolic of broader disconnects with citizen priorities. Insiders within the ruling Sierra Leone People's Party, SLPP, meanwhile, are said to be divided on how to manage the fallout. Some advisors advocate a low-key recovery strategy, hoping that public attention will shift with time, while others push for a nationwide listening tour to reconnect with disenchanted voters and reassert President Bio's domestic focus. "We can't underestimate how emotional April 27 has become," said a senior SLPP strategist who asked not to be named. "It's not just about one absence, it's about a buildup of frustration. If we don't address it directly, the narrative will be written for us." Shifting demographics and the rise of a conscious electorate. At the heart of this brewing political shift is Sierra Leone's youth population, whose political consciousness is both increasingly digital and profoundly emotional. With over 60% of citizens under the age of 35, many of whom were born after the war and grew up under democracy, there is less tolerance for symbolic neglect and unfulfilled promises. Unlike past generations who may have prioritized patronage networks or party loyalty, the post-war youth bloc is issue-driven, tech-savvy, and skeptical of elite excuses. The symbolism of a missing president on Independence Day, for this group, is not easily forgotten. They are already mobilizing through online forums, student unions, and WhatsApp-driven neighborhood town halls to organize around civic values, not just partisan affiliations. This generational change presents both a threat and an opportunity to all political parties. For the SLPP, failure to authentically engage these youth voices could cement perceptions of arrogance and elitism. For the APC and other opposition groups, it's an invitation to rebrand themselves as pro-people, pro-presence, and future-focused. "We're not asking for miracles," said Hawa Bangura, a 24-year-old university graduate and first-time voter. "We're asking for leaders who show up when it matters, not only in crisis or election season." Women's voices and the call for symbolic restoration, alongside youth engagement, women's groups have been especially vocal in highlighting the emotional significance of leadership presence during national rituals. Organizations such as the 50-50 Group, Market Women's Network, and Women in the Media Sierra Leone, WIMSOL, have issued statements emphasizing that Independence Day is not just a historical date, but a spiritual space for collective remembrance, healing, and hope, particularly for women who bore the brunt of war and now carry the weight of household survival. Many of these groups have called for a formal apology or public address from the president, not necessarily as an act of political penance, but as a gesture of symbolic restoration. In doing so, they echo a broader African feminist movement that demands not just inclusion in governance, but emotional accountability from leadership. "Presence is power," said Memunatu Rogers, a community organizer in Cambia. "And when that presence is missing, women feel the weight of abandonment most." Regional implications. a cautionary tale for West African leaders. President Bio's misstep also sends ripples across the broader West African political arena, where symbolism, legitimacy, and proximity to the people are becoming decisive factors in electoral politics. As countries like Ghana, Liberia, and Nigeria prepare for upcoming election cycles or navigate post-election legitimacy crises, Sierra Leone's experience offers a powerful lesson. Political presence, especially during national milestones, is not optional. It's foundational. In Ghana, for instance, President Nana Akufo-Addo's consistent attendance at national celebrations, even amid economic protests, has helped him maintain a narrative of engagement even when facing policy criticism. In Nigeria, President Tinubu's critics often cite his perceived detachment and extended medical absences abroad as a core weakness in his political brand. As ECOWAS nations grapple with rising civic discontent and shifting democratic expectations, symbolic engagement may soon emerge as a core metric of political viability, just as important as macroeconomic indicators or campaign spending. Strategies for political recovery and the emergence of a new civic era. Paths to redemption. How the Bio administration could rebuild trust. Despite the political damage caused by President Bio's Independence Day absence, the situation is not beyond repair. History shows that leaders who acknowledge missteps and re-engage meaningfully with their citizens can sometimes turn adversity into renewed legitimacy. The challenge lies in how swiftly, sincerely, and strategically the Bio administration responds. Several pathways are being discussed among political analysts, civic groups, and even within the corridors of power itself. 1. A nationwide listening and healing tour. One of the most effective ways to counter the perception of detachment would be for President Bio to embark on a listening and healing tour across all regions of Sierra Leone. Rather than scripted political rallies, these would be intimate town hall-style engagements where citizens express their grievances, hopes, and criticisms directly to the president. If carefully executed, with humility, transparency, and a commitment to action, such a tour could not only mend fractured trust, but also signal a shift toward participatory governance, a demand increasingly voiced by Sierra Leoneans. This strategy has precedents. After facing intense public backlash for fuel price hikes in 2018, Ghana's Vice President Mahamudu Bawumia led a listening tour to hear citizens' complaints firsthand, which helped soften public anger and reframe the government's image. 2. Public symbolic acts of recommitment. In political psychology, symbolism is powerful currency. President Bio could organize a day of national reflection and renewal, a public ceremony distinct from Independence Day but designed to honor the sacrifices of Sierra Leoneans, reaffirm national unity, and outline concrete measures for national development. Such a symbolic act would need to be genuinely citizen-centric, involving religious leaders, traditional chiefs, women's groups, youth activists, and diaspora voices. This would help reframe his absence not as betrayal, but as a catalyst for deeper national introspection and collective forward movement. 3. Launch of a People's Agenda 2028 policy platform. If tied to substantive policy reform, symbolic recovery can have lasting effects. To this end, the SLPP could unveil a bold People's Agenda 2028, outlining clear, measurable commitments in education, healthcare, agriculture, youth employment, and governance reform. By involving civil society groups in the drafting process, the administration could demonstrate a pivot from top-down governance to bottom-up inclusion, a powerful counter-narrative to accusations of elitism and detachment. Such a move would also align with best practices in citizen-led policymaking seen recently in places like Rwanda, through Imihigo performance contracts, and Kenya, through participatory budgeting processes at county levels. Grassroots reconciliation, civil society's expanding role. Even if the government fails to act decisively, the momentum of grassroots civic awakening unleashed by this year's Independence Day could have long-term benefits for Sierra Leone's democracy. civil society organizations, CSOs, including the Citizens Advocacy Network, Campaign for Good Governance, and the Sierra Leone Bar Association, are already exploring ways to institutionalize civic engagement forums, people's policy summits, and community development scorecards across districts by creating structured spaces for civic voice, independent of state orchestration. These groups are laying the foundation for a more vigilant, participatory, and resilient citizenry. The era of passive electoral cycles punctuated by disillusionment could give way to a new political culture of continuous accountability and civic co-creation. This shift aligns with trends across Africa where civil society is becoming more decentralized, digitally coordinated, and policy savvy. In Senegal, for instance, the 2024 presidential election saw a historic youth-driven turnout, largely facilitated by grassroots civic tech initiatives, a defining moment for the future of political rituals. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the 2025 Independence Day controversy will be the redefinition of political rituals themselves in Sierra Leone. No longer mere top-down spectacles, national celebrations may increasingly evolve into bottom-up expressions of people's aspirations, memories, and demands. Already, young activists are proposing that future Independence Days be organized through participatory planning committees involving broad representation from youth, women, traditional leaders, people with disabilities, and rural communities, not just the central government. If adopted, such reforms could make Independence Day a living symbol of active citizenship, not just a ceremonial artifact of post-colonial memory. It would be a clear signal that the spirit of April 27th belongs first and foremost to the people, not to any particular government, administration, or political party. 2028. Elections on the horizon, civic symbolism and new voter dynamics, electoral scenarios, how April 27th could echo in 2028. As Sierra Leone edges closer to the 2028 general elections, the political consequences of President Bio's Independence Day absence will likely manifest in complex ways, shaping both voter attitudes and campaign strategies. Analysts at the Institute for Governance Reform, IGR, and Civics Lab Africa suggest that while the controversy may not by itself determine the election's outcome, it cements key narratives that could tip the scales in a close race. Here are three possible electoral scenarios. Scenario 1. Strengthened opposition momentum. If opposition parties, primarily the All People's Congress, APC, but potentially including emerging third force coalitions, capitalize on the absentee leadership narrative, they could mobilize disillusioned youth, first-time voters, and floating voters who are weary of perceived governmental aloofness. Already, APC operatives are planning to frame their candidates as leaders who will be present, accountable, and people-focused, contrasting sharply with the perception of the SLPP as increasingly detached. If the opposition aligns this messaging with grassroots community engagement and economic relief promises, they stand to make serious gains, particularly in swing districts like Cambia, Western Rural, and Port Loko. Scenario 2. SLPP narrative recalibration and recovery. On the other hand, if the ruling SLPP moves quickly to reframe Independence Day as the beginning of a national renewal project, with visible community investment, participatory governance reforms, and strategic public apologies, the party could reclaim lost ground and rebrand President Bio as a leader willing to learn and adapt. This recovery would require moving beyond defensive justifications for the Rome trip and instead showing tangible actions that prioritize citizen welfare. Success in this approach depends heavily on the credibility of messengers within the party and whether internal SLPP factions unite behind a single narrative. Scenario 3. Voter apathy and declining turnout. A third and riskier possibility is that the disappointment generated by the Independence Day controversy fuels voter apathy, particularly among young people and women who feel increasingly alienated from elite politics. If neither major party seizes the opportunity to meaningfully re-engage these voters, turnout rates could plummet, reducing the democratic legitimacy of the eventual winner and potentially setting the stage for post-election instability. Already, Afrobarometer data 2024 indicates that more than 40% of Sierra Leoneans under 30 say they do not believe voting makes a difference. If this sentiment hardens in the wake of leadership disappointments, the 2028 elections could produce a government that is technically elected but morally weakened, with dangerous implications for governance, reform, and peace building. New voter coalitions, civic identity over partisan loyalty. Regardless of which scenario materializes, one trend is clear. Sierra Leone's electoral landscape is shifting away from traditional ethno-regional voting patterns toward issue-based, value-driven alignments. The April 27th events accelerated a subtle but crucial transformation. Youth groups are increasingly organizing around policy demands, jobs, education, technology access, rather than tribal affiliations. Women's associations are mobilizing on platforms of economic inclusion, healthcare reforms, and gender parity in leadership. Diaspora communities are exerting new influence through digital mobilization, remittances, and international advocacy networks. These evolving coalitions are fluid, decentralized, and harder for traditional parties to control. Success in 2028 will likely depend on which political actors best understand and adapt to this new civic-driven, symbol-sensitive electorate. A broader African context. The age of civic awakening. Sierra Leone's experience is not unfolding in isolation. Across Africa, we are witnessing the emergence of a new political consciousness, driven by a potent blend of symbolism, historical memory, and civic agency. Consider these parallels. In Liberia, youth-led movements pressured the Wii administration into committing to electoral reforms ahead of the 2023 polls. In Senegal, peaceful mass protests organized through digital platforms led to constitutional challenges against perceived presidential overreach. In Zambia, youth disillusionment over economic hardships turned into a political earthquake in 2021, unseating incumbent Edgar Lungu and ushering in Hakainde Hichilema with a campaign of new beginnings. In each case, the electorate's demand for authentic, present, and accountable leadership overwhelmed traditional political calculus. Sierra Leone's civic space now shows the same early indicators: rising issue-based activism, growing symbolic literacy, and a willingness to challenge traditional authority structures. Thus, Sierra Leone's April 27th turning point must be seen not just as a national drama, but as part of a continental civic awakening, one where leaders are no longer judged solely on GDP figures or diplomatic ties, but also on their emotional proximity to the people's everyday struggles and dreams. Institutionalizing civic engagement, a new democratic horizon for Sierra Leone, from spontaneous mobilization to structured participation. The vibrant civic energy unleashed during Sierra Leone's 2025 Independence Day presents an unprecedented opportunity, not merely for electoral change, but for deep, institutional transformation of democratic participation. Historically, Sierra Leone's civic activism has been episodic, often rising during election cycles or crises and receding thereafter. If the momentum generated by April 27th is to have lasting political and social impact, it must now transition from ad hoc mobilization to structured, institutionalized forms of citizen engagement. Policy researchers and civil society leaders are already proposing a series of reforms designed to embed civic agency into the very fabric of governance, ensuring that future leaders, regardless of party, cannot afford to treat national sentiment, symbolism, and citizen voice as afterthoughts. Some of the key proposals gaining traction include: 1. Establishment of a National Civic Engagement Commission, NCEC, civil society coalitions, including the Campaign for Good Governance and the Center for Accountability and Rule of Law, are advocating for the creation of a National Civic Engagement Commission, an independent, nonpartisan body tasked with coordinating annual citizen feedback forums across all districts, monitoring government responsiveness to citizen complaints and recommendations, overseeing civic education programs in schools, focusing on rights, responsibilities, and leadership ethics, publishing annual State of Civic Engagement reports, benchmarking government performance on citizen participation metrics. Such a body could institutionalize dialogue between citizens and the state, moving beyond tokenistic consultations toward systematic, transparent engagement processes. 2. Legislative reforms to protect and expand civic space. Activists are also pushing for amendments to existing laws to safeguard freedom of assembly, speech, and association, especially ahead of major national events like Independence Day. Key proposals include simplified procedures for public gatherings without excessive police permits, stronger legal protections for whistleblowers, journalists, and civil society actors, mandated civic consultation before major national policy rollouts, particularly in sectors like education, healthcare, and constitutional reform. These legislative changes would mirror reforms in countries like Tunisia, post-2011 revolution, and Kenya, under the 2010 Constitution, where civic participation is enshrined as a constitutional right, not a government favor. 3. Decentralized planning of national celebrations. Recognizing the symbolic importance of national rituals, civic groups are advocating for a decentralized model of Independence Day planning, rotating the main celebration among different provinces each year, including citizen representatives on organizing committees. Encouraging thematic commemorations, e.g., economic empowerment, reconciliation, innovation, that allow citizens to see their own struggles and aspirations reflected in national pride. This approach would not only distribute symbolic capital across regions, but also foster a deeper, more inclusive sense of ownership over national identity. Regional inspirations, the rise of participatory democracy in West Africa. Sierra Leone's potential civic reforms would not occur in isolation. Across West Africa, there is a visible trend toward formalizing citizen participation mechanisms as a hedge against authoritarian drift and political disillusionment. In Senegal, the National Dialogue Framework legally mandates the involvement of civil society in key national policy debates. In Liberia, post-war reconstruction included the establishment of a governance commission that regularly convenes citizen panels on constitutional and electoral reforms. In Ghana, participatory budgeting at the local government level has allowed communities to directly influence infrastructure projects and resource allocation. These examples suggest that institutionalizing civic engagement is not only desirable but feasible, and that Sierra Leone could join the vanguard of African states redefining democracy not as an event every 5 years, but as a continuous, living relationship between citizens and the state. Civic challenges. Ahead, guarding against cooptation and fatigue. While the energy of April 27th is inspiring, activists and reformists are wary of potential pitfalls, cooptation by political elites who may seek to brand civic initiatives without implementing real change. Activist fatigue, if momentum is not sustained by clear wins and institutional support. Fragmentation, as diverse groups with differing agendas compete for limited platforms and resources. To counter these risks, emerging civic leaders emphasize the need for coalition building, strategic patience, and a shared long-term vision, recognizing that real transformation is a marathon, not a sprint. As Isata Kalan, a young activist from Kenema, put it during a youth dialogue hosted by the Center for Democracy and Human Rights, CDHR, "We have the passion now, but we must also build the structures. That is how we honor those who fought for our independence and those who still fight for our dignity today. Constitutional reform, intergenerational leadership, and regional democratic ripples. The next frontier, constitutional reform and citizen sovereignty. The rejuvenated civic energy ignited by Sierra Leone's 2025 Independence Day could also reinvigorate stalled discussions around constitutional reform, a conversation that has loomed large but remained politically sensitive since the end of the Civil War in 2002. Historically, Sierra Leone's constitutional framework, rooted in the 1991 Constitution, has been criticized for over-centralizing executive power, limiting direct citizen participation, and failing to adapt to post-war democratic realities. Various initiatives, such as the Constitutional Review Committee, CRC, launched in 2013, produced promising recommendations, e.g., term limit reinforcement, electoral reform, decentralization. But most of these proposals have languished due to elite resistance and political expediency. Today, however, the civic momentum generated by April 27th provides a rare political opening for a new, people-driven constitutional conversation, one that prioritizes devolution of power to local councils and traditional authorities, expanded rights to civic participation beyond electoral voting through citizen-led policy initiatives and referenda, enhanced checks and balances on executive authority, especially concerning presidential absence, emergency powers, and succession planning. Protection of public commemorations as non-partisan civic holidays, safeguarded from politicization or neglect. If Sierra Leone's civil society successfully leverages this moment, the country could position itself as a regional model of bottom-up constitutional evolution, a powerful counter-narrative to the creeping trend of constitutional manipulation for authoritarian ends seen elsewhere on the continent. True independence requires more than a date. It demands a constitution that serves the people's will, not political convenience, argued Abdoulaye Ba, a constitutional law scholar, during a public lecture at Fora Bay College on May 1, 2025. Intergenerational leadership. The rise of a new political class. Another profound implication of the current civic awakening is the emergence of intergenerational political demands. The post-war generation, those born after 2002, is increasingly positioning itself not as passive beneficiaries of peace, but as active architects of a new political order. This generational shift manifests in several ways. Youth-led advocacy coalitions, such as Achi, Voice of the Future, and Not Too Young to Lead Salon, are calling for lower age thresholds for political office eligibility and increased youth quotas in political party structures. Intergenerational dialogue forums are being organized across universities, trade unions, and professional associations, aiming to bridge the gap between legacy politicians and new civic actors. Digital activism hubs are amplifying young voices, bypassing traditional party machinery and mainstream media bottlenecks. This dynamic mirrors trends in Nigeria, where the Not Too Young to Run movement succeeded in altering constitutional age limits for candidacy, and in South Africa, where youth-led movements like Fees Must Fall evolved into powerful civic platforms influencing national discourse. For Sierra Leone, nurturing this intergenerational leadership transition is crucial to sustaining democratic resilience, preventing political ossification, and expanding the pool of innovation in governance. The regional ripple, implications for ECOWAS and West African stability. Sierra Leone's unfolding civic transformation carries broader implications for West Africa, particularly within the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, framework, which has faced challenges in recent years amid coups in Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso, driven partly by civic frustration with entrenched leadership, controversial constitutional amendments enabling third terms in Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea under Condé, and Senegal, debated under Macky Sall. Declining trust in regional governance structures, with Afrobarometer 2024 surveys showing falling confidence in ECOWAS's ability to defend democratic norms. In this fragile environment, Sierra Leone's peaceful, civic-led redefinition of national identity and political accountability could offer a hopeful counterexample that democratic renewal is possible without violence, military intervention, or constitutional betrayal. Regional democracy advocates are closely watching whether Sierra Leone's citizens and their government can translate symbolic awakening into institutional consolidation. Success here could reinvigorate ECOWAS' democracy promotion agenda, strengthen Sierra Leone's voice in continental affairs, and inspire grassroots democratic innovations across West Africa. If Sierra Leone can show that civic dignity, not just state power, defines national destiny, it will not only redeem its own democracy, but enrich Africa's democratic imagination, said Dr. Fatoumata Diallo, a political scientist specializing in West African governance at Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar. Safeguarding the civic momentum, risks, threats, and strategic pathways. Forward. Potential threats to Sierra Leone's civic awakening. As promising as the April 27, 2025, movement has been for Sierra Leone's democratic evolution, history warns that civic momentum can be fragile, especially in young or recovering democracies. Without proactive strategies, the energy now visible in streets, universities, religious centers, and digital platforms could be co-opted, repressed, or dissipated. Several critical risks loom on the horizon. 1. Political elite, pushback, and co-optation. When faced with rising civic consciousness, political elites often respond not with reform, but with attempts to co-opt, dilute, or suppress the movement. Co-optation tactics might involve government-sponsored youth engagement programs that offer superficial participation without real power sharing. Divide and rule strategies may be deployed to fracture civil society into competing ethnic, regional, or ideological factions. Selective patronage could be used to reward compliant civic leaders while marginalizing dissenters. Unless civil society actors remain vigilant, united, and independent, there is a danger that the genuine civic awakening sparked by April 27th could become absorbed into traditional patronage politics, losing its transformative potential. 2. International distraction and declining donor attention. Sierra Leone's democracy has historically benefited from international support, whether from ECOWAS, the African Union, the United Nations, or bilateral partners such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union. However, global geopolitical tensions, from the Ukraine conflict to economic crises in Europe and America, have strained donor priorities. There is a real risk that Sierra Leone's democratic consolidation could be overshadowed on the international stage, reducing critical funding and advocacy support for civil society initiatives. Democracy dies not only by bullets, but also by neglect, warned Ambassador Maria Olsen, EU representative in Sierra Leone, during a governance forum in Freetown in March 2025. 3. Economic volatility and public frustration. With inflation hovering above 25%, high youth unemployment, and persistent currency depreciation. World Bank Sierra Leone Economic Update, April 2025. Economic frustrations remain a tinderbox. If economic grievances are not urgently addressed through job creation, price stabilization, and social safety nets, there is a risk that despair could overwhelm democratic patience, leading to political apathy, civil unrest, a resurgence of populist or authoritarian appeals. Thus, economic recovery is inseparable from democratic survival. A hungry population is vulnerable not just to poverty, but to political manipulation and extremism. Strategic pathways to sustain and institutionalize civic gains. Recognizing these threats, civil society actors, reform-minded politicians, development partners, and engaged citizens must work together to build resilience mechanisms for Sierra Leone's evolving democracy. Key strategic recommendations include: 1. Civic movement institutionalization. Rather than remaining informal or ad hoc, emerging civic networks should formalize their operations by registering as independent, transparent organizations, creating decentralized chapters across regions and chiefdoms, building alliances across sectors, linking students, workers, farmers, faith groups, and the private sector, establishing internal democratic governance systems to model the change they demand nationally. Formalization can provide legal protection, funding opportunities, and organizational longevity beyond emotional or social media-driven mobilizations. 2. Strategic nonpartisanship and issue-based advocacy. Civic actors must resist partisan capture by any political party. Remaining non-aligned allows movements to maintain credibility, flexibility, and cross-sectional appeal. Advocacy should center around concrete, measurable issues, such as education funding, healthcare access, election integrity, and constitutional reform, rather than personalities or parties. Issue-based movements are harder to fracture and easier to scale nationally. 3. Regional solidarity and knowledge exchange. Sierra Leone's civil society should deepen partnerships with counterparts in Ghana, Liberia, Senegal, Kenya, and South Africa, countries where civic movements have successfully influenced national reform processes. Peer learning exchanges, civic technology collaborations, regional democracy solidarity networks. Such regional linkages would amplify Sierra Leone's voice, enhance movement strategies, and create transnational pressure mechanisms to deter authoritarian backsliding. 4. Building an economic justice agenda. To address the underlying economic roots of democratic fragility, civic groups must connect political reform demands to economic justice issues, advocating for fair labor practices and youth entrepreneurship support, demanding greater budget transparency and anti-corruption enforcement, promoting inclusive economic policies that bridge rural, urban, and gender gaps. This holistic approach would align citizen empowerment with material improvements, ensuring that democracy is not just a slogan, but a pathway to dignified livelihoods. A cautious but hopeful future. April 27, 2025 will likely be remembered not only as a day of presidential absence, but as the catalyst for Sierra Leone's second democratic awakening. The road ahead remains fraught with challenges, but the unprecedented convergence of youth energy, civic imagination, and historical consciousness offers a rare chance to reforge the nation's destiny. The ultimate test will not be whether politicians apologize, elections are won, or speeches are made. It will be whether the people, the true custodians of independence, stay vigilant, organized, and courageous enough to claim, defend, and expand the democratic space now opening before them. Projecting Sierra Leone's trajectory to 2030, democratic renewal or missed opportunity. Mapping the road ahead, key scenarios for Sierra Leone by 2030. As Sierra Leone stands at the threshold of a potential democratic renaissance, projecting into the future allows us to assess possibilities, anticipate risks, and set measurable benchmarks for national progress. The next 5 years will be critical in determining whether the civic awakening sparked by April 27, 2025, evolves into sustained democratic deepening or dissipates into another chapter of missed opportunities. Based on current trends, we can envision 3 broad trajectories. Scenario 1. Democratic consolidation and civic empowerment. In this optimistic pathway, Sierra Leone successfully harnesses its civic momentum, institutionalizes reforms, and builds a more resilient, participatory democracy. Key milestones under this scenario would include a peaceful, high-turnout 2028 election marked by broad citizen engagement, issue-based campaigns, and a credible electoral process. Establishment of the National Civic Engagement Commission, NCEC, and regular citizen government dialogues at national and district levels. Meaningful constitutional reforms enhancing decentralization, electoral integrity, and executive accountability. A thriving, nonpartisan civil society sector, partnering with government where appropriate, while retaining independence and advocacy strength. Economic reforms that empower youth, women, and rural communities, helping reduce poverty and creating visible development gains. If achieved, Sierra Leone would position itself by 2030 as a model for post-conflict democratic renewal in Africa, joining the ranks of countries like Ghana and Botswana, where political stability, citizen engagement, and social progress reinforce one another. Scenario 2. Partial progress, persistent fragility. In a more mixed outcome, Sierra Leone could experience moderate improvements in democratic practices without fundamentally transforming the structures of political power or economic inequality. Indicators under this scenario might include fair but low-energy elections, with modest reforms but persistent distrust among marginalized groups. Selective implementation of civic reforms, with urban centers benefiting more than rural areas. Limited constitutional change, with only cosmetic adjustments to executive power, civil society fatigue or fragmentation driven by internal divisions, funding shortfalls, or elite co-optation, economic growth that benefits a narrow elite, leaving underlying social tensions unresolved. Under this trajectory, Sierra Leone would avoid dramatic backsliding but remain trapped in cycles of semi-accountable governance, slow reforms, and periodic civic frustration, progress, but without transformation. Scenario 3. Democratic erosion and authoritarian drift. In the worst-case scenario, civic momentum falters, and authoritarian tendencies resurge, whether through overt repression or subtler forms of civic space restriction. Warning signs for this trajectory would include contested or violent elections in 2028, marred by voter suppression, intimidation, or judicial manipulation, rolling back of press freedoms and civil liberties, justified under the pretext of national security or stability, absence of meaningful constitutional reform, allowing entrenched political elites to entrench themselves further, civic demobilization, as youth and activists lose hope and retreat from public life, deepening economic inequality and mass unemployment, fueling migration pressures, social unrest, or even isolated violence. If this scenario materializes, Sierra Leone would join the ranks of countries like Guinea under Alpha Condé's third-term crisis, or Burkina Faso before its successive coups, where missed democratic opportunities fueled instability and regression. Sierra Leone as a regional beacon, a vision worth pursuing. If Sierra Leone successfully navigates its current crossroads, the implications would extend far beyond its borders. A thriving, citizen-led democracy in Sierra Leone would offer a counter-narrative to the prevailing cynicism about governance in West Africa, inspiring movements in Guinea, Liberia, the Gambia, and beyond. Moreover, Sierra Leone's story would affirm that post-conflict societies can recover not just materially, but spiritually and politically, building not just roads and markets, but trust, belonging, and democratic resilience. Africa does not lack for history. It lacks for institutions that honor that history and citizens who defend it, said Dr. Mo Ibrahim, founder of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, in his 2024 Governance Index report. Sierra Leone now has a chance to prove that history can also be destiny, if courage meets opportunity. Practical Roadmap for Democratic Consolidation in Sierra Leone, 2025-2030, Action Plans for Sustaining Civic Momentum and Democratic Gains. For Sierra Leone's democratic renaissance to be secured, all actors, civic groups, government leaders, political parties, international partners, and citizens must take proactive, coordinated actions. The coming years must be approached not as a passive waiting game, but as a deliberate project of nation-building, democratic deepening, and social renewal. Here's a practical roadmap tailored for each key actor. For civic groups, expand and decentralize operations, strengthen rural chapters to ensure grassroots voices shape national debates, invest in leadership development, build the next generation of civic leaders through training, mentorship, and peer exchanges. Adopt evidence-based advocacy, anchor campaigns in solid research, data, and policy proposals rather than purely emotional appeals. Forge broad-based coalitions, build alliances beyond traditional civil society, engaging religious bodies, traditional chiefs, artists, entrepreneurs, and the diaspora. For the government, institutionalize citizen engagement, create legally binding frameworks for participatory budgeting, community dialogues, and citizen feedback mechanisms. Honor symbolism. Restore the significance of national holidays and ceremonies by embedding citizen participation, not just official pageantry. Protect civic freedoms. Refrain from restrictive legislation that could stifle media freedom, digital activism, or peaceful assembly. Deliver economic justice. Prioritize job creation, access to capital, and anti-corruption measures to stabilize the political environment and rebuild trust. For political parties, both ruling and opposition, move beyond personality politics. Develop issue-based platforms and elevate debates around governance, economy, health, education, and youth empowerment. Promote internal democracy. Ensure that political party leadership reflects the diversity of the nation, including youth, women, and marginalized communities. Commit to peaceful competition. Sign pre-election codes of conduct affirming nonviolence, respect for results, and post-election national unity efforts. For international partners, sustain funding for civil society, prioritize long-term capacity building rather than short-term election projects. Support institutional reforms, focus aid and technical support on electoral commissions, judiciary independence, civic education, and anti-corruption bodies. Respect local agency, avoid imposing external models. Instead, empower local actors to lead context-specific reform agendas. Advice to African leaders. To African leaders watching the unfolding story of Sierra Leone and beyond, the lessons are clear. Presence matters. In moments of national pride, grief, or crisis, being physically and emotionally present among the people speaks louder than foreign trips or diplomatic platitudes. Symbolism is substance. Do not underestimate the power of symbolic leadership. National holidays, anniversaries, and civic rituals are moments to reaffirm the social contract, not trivial ceremonies to delegate or overlook. Youth are not the future, they are the present. Engage, empower, and listen to young citizens. Failing to do so invites irrelevance at best or unrest at worst. Democracy is a daily labor. Winning elections is not enough. Building trust, delivering justice, and fostering dignity must be continuous, visible efforts. Constitutional manipulation is a dead end. Attempts to entrench power through legal engineering almost always end in resistance, instability, or disgrace. True legacy is built on strengthening institutions, not weakening them. Those African leaders who embrace humility, prioritize their people's dignity, and strengthen participatory governance will not only secure their place in history, they will leave behind nations truly worthy of their sacrifices. Summary of key messages. President Bio's absence during Sierra Leone's Independence Day celebrations in 2025 sparked a profound civic awakening, raising critical questions about leadership, symbolism, and national priorities. The citizen-led response demonstrated the resilience, creativity, and agency of Sierra Leoneans, particularly youth and women. The controversy offers an unprecedented opportunity for democratic consolidation, constitutional reform, and the institutionalization of civic engagement. Three possible futures lie ahead: democratic consolidation, partial progress, or regression into authoritarianism. Vigilance, organization, nonpartisanship, and economic justice will be essential for sustaining momentum. Sierra Leone's experience has regional significance, offering lessons for Africa on the power of civic action and the centrality of symbolic leadership. Ultimately, the future belongs to citizens who refuse to relinquish their voice, and to leaders wise enough to walk beside them, not above them. The story of Sierra Leone is still being written. Whether it becomes a cautionary tale or a beacon of hope depends on what happens next, and whether those entrusted with leadership will heed the call of history, humility, and the people. Thank you for joining us on the Bold African Voice, BAV. If you believe Africa deserves leadership rooted in presence, accountability, and courage, don't just watch, be part of the change. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to stay with us as we boldly dissect the issues shaping our continent's future. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay bold.